Four Seasons Hotel Sultanahmet, Istanbul, Turkey. October 18, 2011, 9:23 p.m. A man in an expensive charcoal suit steps out of a black Mercedes S-Class at the entrance of one of Istanbul's most prestigious hotels. His name, according to the passport he presents at reception, is Henrik van der Meer, a Dutch venture capital investor staying in Istanbul for a technology conference. His reservation is for the Bosphorus suite on the 18th floor, a sprawling luxury accommodation with panoramic views across the straits that divide Europe from Asia. The nightly rate is €8,000. Mr. van der Meer pays in cash, explains he values privacy, and requests that housekeeping not enter his suite during his stay. The hotel staff notes this as unusual but not unprecedented among their wealthier guests, who often conduct sensitive business negotiations or simply value discretion. What the impeccably trained reception staff cannot know, what the security cameras recording this ordinary check-in cannot reveal, is that Henrik van der Meer doesn't exist. The passport is forged, though expertly enough to pass any inspection short of verification with Dutch immigration databases. The venture capital firm he claims to represent is a shell company registered in Luxembourg with a website, office address, and corporate history that appear completely legitimate but are entirely fabricated. And the man himself is a Mossad officer whose actual name and background are classified at levels that ensure they'll remain unknown for decades. Over the next 6 hours, 5 more guests check into the Four Seasons. They arrive separately, use different entrances, carry passports from different countries. A German software consultant, a British telecommunications engineer, a French business analyst, an Italian market researcher, a Spanish financial advisor. None of them know each other according to hotel records. None of them are staying on the same floor. Their reservations were made through different booking platforms at different times. To hotel security reviewing the evening's arrivals, they're exactly what they appear to be: mid-level European professionals in Istanbul for business, the kind of guests the Four Seasons hosts by the hundreds every week. But by 3:47 a.m., all 6 of these guests are inside the Bosphorus suite on the 18th floor. The spacious living room has been transformed into something that looks more like a military command center than luxury accommodation. Laptop computers are arranged on the dining table, their screens displaying maps, surveillance feeds, and encrypted communication channels. Technical equipment that definitely didn't come through hotel security is being unpacked from specialized cases. One of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Bosphorus now has a directional microphone positioned against the glass, aimed at a hotel 700 meters across the water where another guest, this one genuinely unaware he's being monitored, sleeps in a room that Israeli intelligence has been watching for 3 weeks. This is the story of how Mossad ran an entire intelligence operation from a single hotel suite, how they turned one of Istanbul's most visible luxury hotels into invisible operational headquarters, and how they recruited an Iranian nuclear scientist without ever leaving the building. And here's what makes this absolutely insane. The hotel helped them do it, completely unknowingly, by simply providing the exact kind of luxury service and discretion that made the operation possible. Let me take you back to understand why Istanbul became the perfect theater for this operation. Istanbul isn't just any city. It's the only major city in the world that sits on 2 continents. The Bosphorus Strait literally divides it between Europe and Asia. You can have breakfast on one continent and lunch on another without even needing a passport. But the geographic split is just the beginning of what makes Istanbul operationally valuable. The city exists in a political and cultural gray zone that intelligence agencies have exploited for centuries. Turkey is a NATO member, officially aligned with the West, maintaining diplomatic and economic ties with both the United States and Israel. But Turkey is also a Muslim-majority country with deep historical, cultural, and economic connections throughout the Middle East. It maintains relations with Iran even when those relations are complicated. Turkish businessmen do deals in Tehran. Iranian tourists visit Istanbul by the thousands. Students, scientists, and professionals from Iran travel to Turkey for conferences, medical treatment, shopping, and business opportunities they can't access in their own country due to sanctions and international isolation. This creates something intelligence professionals call operational space, an environment where people from countries that are hostile to each other can physically be in the same place without it being unusual or suspicious. An Iranian scientist can attend a conference in Istanbul without his government questioning why he's traveling to a city that has business relationships with Israel. An Israeli intelligence officer can operate in Istanbul under European cover without Turkish authorities necessarily knowing or, in some cases, particularly caring, as long as the operation doesn't threaten Turkish interests or create public incidents that force diplomatic responses. Istanbul in 2011 was experiencing an economic boom. The city was positioning itself as a bridge between East and West, attracting international investment, hosting global conferences, and marketing itself as the business capital of a rising regional power. Luxury hotels were opening throughout the historic districts and modern business centers. The Four Seasons Sultanahmet, housed in a meticulously restored neoclassical building that had once been a prison, represent exactly the kind of sophisticated international hospitality that Istanbul wanted to project. Wealthy businessmen from around the world stayed there. Technology entrepreneurs, finance executives, venture capitalists, the kind of people who conduct sensitive negotiations, value privacy, and pay premium rates for discretion. For Mossad, this environment was perfect. They could establish cover identities as European investors interested in Middle Eastern markets without raising suspicion. They could rent expensive hotel suites and fill them with equipment without housekeeping asking questions, because wealthy guests who pay for privacy expect not to be disturbed. They could conduct surveillance operations in a city dense with targets. Iranian operatives who felt safe because they were in a Muslim country that maintained diplomatic relations with Tehran. Iranian scientists and engineers who traveled to Istanbul for legitimate business or academic purposes, never imagining that Israeli intelligence was tracking their movements and planning approaches. The specific target for this operation had been identified 6 months earlier through signals intelligence that indicated he was becoming increasingly disillusioned with his work in Iran's nuclear program. His communications suggested financial stress, frustration with the regime, and concern about his daughter's medical condition, which required treatment not available in Iran. Those three factors, financial vulnerability, ideological disillusionment, and family pressure, create the classic recruitment opportunity that intelligence agencies look for. But approaching him in Iran was impossible. Approaching him in a Western country would be too obvious and too risky. Istanbul provided the perfect middle ground where an approach could be made to look like something else entirely. The operation didn't begin in Istanbul. It began 6 months earlier in Tel Aviv, in a windowless conference room at Mossad headquarters, where the operational planning team assembled to design what they called the cover architecture. You can't just show up in Istanbul with fake passports and hope nobody investigates. Modern intelligence operations require what's known as legend building, creating false identities that are deep enough and detailed enough to withstand serious scrutiny. The team decided their cover would be a European venture capital firm called Nordica Capital Partners, supposedly based in Amsterdam with satellite offices in London and Luxembourg. The firm would specialize in emerging market technology investments, particularly in Eastern Europe, Turkey, and Central Asia. This cover served multiple purposes. It explained why European businessmen would be in Istanbul. It provided a legitimate reason to meet with scientists and engineers who might have commercial technology applications, and it created a financial context where discussing money, offering payments, and proposing business relationships would seem completely normal. Creating Nordica Capital Partners required meticulous attention to detail. Mossad established actual corporate registrations in the Netherlands and Luxembourg, using shell companies and nominee directors whose backgrounds were clean enough to pass basic verification. They created a professional website showcasing a portfolio of supposed investments, complete with case studies and market analysis that were entirely fictional, but written with enough technical sophistication to appear genuine. They rented a small office in Amsterdam's financial district, installed phones and internet service, and hired a local receptionist through a staffing agency who had no idea the company she was representing barely existed. The receptionist's job was simply to answer calls, take messages, and forward them to email addresses monitored by Mossad officers in Tel Aviv. If anyone called to verify that Nordica Capital Partners was a real company, they'd reach a real office with a real person who could confirm that yes, Henrik Vandermeer and his colleagues worked there and were currently traveling for business development in Turkey. They created email accounts, LinkedIn profiles, and professional credentials for each member of the team. Henrik Vandermeer's LinkedIn showed a 15-year career in venture capital with previous positions at firms that actually existed. His profile had connections to real people in the European investment community, some of whom had been approached by Mossad operatives under other pretexts and asked to accept connection requests as part of what they thought was legitimate networking. His email history, if anyone managed to access it, showed months of correspondence about investment opportunities, meeting schedules, and business development activities. Every detail was designed to create depth, to ensure that if Turkish intelligence or Iranian counterintelligence decided to investigate these European investors, they'd find a consistent story that held up under examination. This level of legend building is expensive and time-consuming. It cost Mossad approximately $2 million to create and maintain Nordica Capital Partners for the 8 months it existed. But that investment bought them something invaluable: the ability to operate in Istanbul with cover identities solid enough that the team could conduct their mission without constantly worrying about exposure. His name was Dr. Reza Ahmadi. That's not his real name, because identifying him specifically could endanger people who are still alive, but his story is real. Dr. Ahmadi was a nuclear physicist, 43 years old, educated in Russia, employed at one of Iran's nuclear research facilities where he worked on uranium enrichment technology. To the outside world, he was part of Iran's civilian nuclear energy program. To Israeli intelligence, he was working on weapons development, helping Iran move closer to nuclear capability that would fundamentally alter the strategic balance in the Middle East. But Dr. Ahmadi was becoming a problem for his own government. He'd begun asking uncomfortable questions about the true purpose of his work. He'd expressed concern to colleagues about whether they were actually building peaceful energy infrastructure or weapons that would invite international retaliation. These concerns had been noted by Iranian security services, but Dr. Ahmadi was too valuable to dismiss. He possessed specialized knowledge that Iran's nuclear program needed. So instead of removing him, his supervisors decided to give him an opportunity to travel, to attend an international conference on advanced material science in Istanbul, where he could present research on metallurgy applications that were genuinely civilian in nature. Dr. Ahmadi arrived in Istanbul on October 19, 2011, on a commercial flight from Tehran. He checked into the Pera Palace Hotel, a historic establishment in the Beyoğlu district known for hosting international academics and business travelers. His room was modest compared to the Four Seasons suites where the Mossad team was headquartered, but it was comfortable and located in a neighborhood filled with restaurants, cafes, and cultural attractions. Dr. Ahmadi had 4 days in Istanbul. The conference occupied 2 of those days. The remaining time was his own, a rare opportunity to experience a cosmopolitan city far from the restrictions and surveillance of Tehran. He'd been told he could explore Istanbul, enjoy the food, visit the historic sites. What he hadn't been told was that Iranian intelligence officers would be watching him the entire time, not because they suspected him of planning to defect, but because monitoring their own personnel abroad was standard security protocol. What neither Dr. Ahmadi nor his Iranian watchers knew was that Israeli intelligence had been tracking his travel plans for 3 weeks. They knew his flight number, his hotel reservation, his conference schedule. They'd identified the Iranian security officers assigned to monitor him by analyzing travel patterns of known Iranian intelligence personnel who'd flown to Istanbul on the same day. And they'd planned an approach operation that would make contact with Dr. Ahmadi in a way that wouldn't trigger suspicion from his watchers or compromise their own operational security. The approach would happen through what appeared to be a chance business meeting, a conversation that would seem completely innocent, but was actually a carefully scripted recruitment pitch designed to flip an Iranian nuclear scientist into an Israeli intelligence asset. The location would be neutral ground, a restaurant popular with international business travelers where 2 professionals having dinner wouldn't attract attention. And the pitch would be made by someone Dr. Ahmadi would want to talk to, a European investor supposedly interested in commercial applications of advanced materials technology. Inside the Bosphorus suite at the Four Seasons, the Mossad technical team had transformed luxury accommodation into a functioning intelligence operations center. The 18-foot ceilings and ornate Ottoman-inspired decor remained unchanged, but the furniture had been rearranged to create workstations. The suite's dining table now held 4 laptop computers running specialized surveillance software. The sitting area had been converted into a monitoring station where 2 operators watched multiple video feeds simultaneously. And the bedroom, normally the suite's most luxurious feature, had become a secure communications room where encrypted satellite uplinks transmitted real-time updates back to Tel Aviv. The technical capabilities they'd installed in this single hotel room were remarkable. A directional microphone aimed across the Bosphorus could pick up conversations happening in outdoor areas of the Para Palace Hotel where Dr. Ahmadi was staying. The device used laser technology to detect vibrations in windows, converting those vibrations back into audio that could be recorded and analyzed. It wasn't perfect, background noise and distance created quality issues, but it was effective enough to monitor conversations happening in the target's hotel room when the window was open. They'd also hacked into Istanbul's municipal surveillance camera network, not through some dramatic cybersecurity breach, but through a more mundane vulnerability. One of the team members had posed as a Turkish government IT contractor and gained access to network credentials that allowed them to view camera feeds from traffic monitoring systems throughout the city. This gave them the ability to track Dr. Ahmadi's movements as he traveled between his hotel and the conference venue. They could watch him leave the Para Palace, follow his taxi through city traffic, and confirm when he arrived at his destinations. The Iranian security officers following him were also visible in these feeds, allowing the Mossad team to identify their patterns and plan approaches when the watchers were temporarily out of position. Additionally, they'd intercepted Dr. Ahmadi's mobile phone communications. This required cooperation from Turkish intelligence services, though that cooperation was provided indirectly. Turkey's Signals Intelligence Agency routinely monitored foreign visitors, particularly from countries like Iran. Mossad had a liaison relationship with Turkish intelligence that allowed for limited information sharing when interests aligned. Israeli officers made a quiet request for access to intercepts involving Iranian nationals, attending the materials science conference. Turkish intelligence, which had its own concerns about Iranian activities in Turkey, agreed to provide the data without asking too many questions about what Israel planned to do with it. The phone intercepts revealed that Dr. Ahmadi had been communicating with someone in Istanbul before his arrival. The messages were vague, mentioning a possible business meeting, discussing commercial opportunities for materials technology. The person he was communicating with used a European phone number and email address. What Dr. Ahmadi didn't know was that this contact had been initiated by Mossad 3 weeks earlier. An operative posing as a business development consultant for Nordica Capital Partners had reached out through academic networks, expressing interest in Dr. Ahmadi's published research on advanced metallurgy. The communication had been carefully crafted to seem like legitimate business outreach, the kind of contact that happens frequently when venture capital firms scan academic publications looking for commercially viable technology. Dr. Ahmadi had responded cautiously but with interest. He'd indicated he might be traveling to Istanbul for a conference and could potentially meet if schedules aligned. The Mossad operative had suggested dinner at a seafood restaurant in Karaköy, a neighborhood along the Bosphorus known for international cuisine and business dining. Dr. Ahmadi had tentatively agreed pending his conference schedule. Karaköy Lokantası, Istanbul, October 21, 2011, 7:30 p.m. Dr. Ahmadi arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early, a nervous habit that Mossad's psychological profile had predicted. He wore a dark blazer over a button-down shirt, attempting to look professional for what he believed was a genuine business meeting. The restaurant was busy with the evening crowd, international businessmen and Turkish professionals, filling the tables along the waterfront terrace. The location had been chosen deliberately. It was public enough that a meeting wouldn't seem suspicious, upscale enough to match the cover story of European investors, and positioned in a way that made Iranian surveillance difficult without being obvious. The Mossad team watching from the Four Seasons could see the restaurant's entrance through their directional optics. They'd also positioned a street team, 2 operatives posing as tourists with cameras who could provide ground-level observation and intervene if something went wrong. Henrik Vandermeer arrived exactly on time. He approached Dr. Ahmadi's table with the confident posture of someone accustomed to business negotiations, shook hands warmly, and apologized for the slight delay in traffic. The first 20 minutes of their conversation was entirely about business. Vandermeer explained that Nordica Capital Partners was exploring investment opportunities in advanced materials technology, particularly applications that could be commercialized in European markets. He'd read Dr. Ahmadi's published research on high-temperature metallurgy and was impressed by the potential industrial applications. He asked technical questions that demonstrated genuine understanding, questions that had been prepared by Israeli scientists who'd studied Dr. Ahmadi's work and knew exactly which topics would engage him intellectually. Dr. Ahmadi responded enthusiastically. This was the first time in years that anyone had expressed interest in the commercial potential of his research rather than its weapons applications. He talked about metallurgical processes, about temperature tolerances and stress resistance, about potential uses in aerospace manufacturing and energy infrastructure. Vandermeer listened attentively, took notes, asked follow-up questions that showed he was tracking the technical details. Then, as their main courses arrived, Vandermeer shifted the conversation. He said that Nordica Capital Partners was interested in potentially funding research that Dr. Ahmadi could conduct independently outside his current institutional affiliations. They'd be willing to provide generous research grants, perhaps 200,000 euros annually, for work that could be published openly and commercialized internationally. Dr. Ahmadi's expression changed. He understood immediately what was being suggested. This wasn't about technology licensing or consulting arrangements. This was about leaving Iran, or at least about conducting research that would be independent of Iranian government control. He asked carefully whether such an arrangement would require him to relocate. Vandermeer said not necessarily, though having the flexibility to travel freely and collaborate with European institutions would certainly make the research more valuable. He mentioned that researchers they funded often found it beneficial to establish residency in European Union countries where they could work without restrictions. Dr. Ahmadi sat quietly for a moment, processing what he was hearing. Then he asked the question that would determine everything that followed. He asked who Vandermeer really worked for. The moment of truth in any recruitment operation is when the target realizes they're not having the conversation they thought they were having. Some targets react with anger, feeling deceived and manipulated. Some panic and try to leave immediately. Some become calculating, trying to figure out how to use the situation to their advantage. Dr. Ahmadi's reaction was different. He looked tired, like someone who'd been carrying a weight for too long and was almost relieved to set it down. Vandermeer didn't answer directly. Instead, he said that the organization he represented had deep concerns about nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, that they believed Dr. Ahmadi's work was being misused for purposes he didn't support, and that they could offer him a way to continue his scientific career while also preventing his research from contributing to weapons development that could destabilize the entire region. Dr. Ahmadi asked if this was Israeli intelligence. Vandermeer still didn't confirm directly, maintaining the thin layer of deniability that operational protocols required, but his silence was confirmation enough. Dr. Ahmadi should have stood up and left at that moment. He should have reported the contact to Iranian security immediately. That would have been the loyal, safe response. But he didn't leave. He stayed seated, and he asked what would happen if he refused to cooperate. Vandermeer explained that nothing would happen, that they weren't threatening him, that he was free to walk away and forget this conversation ever occurred. But Vandermeer also said that opportunities like this don't come often, that Dr. Ahmadi was in a unique position to make a choice about his future and his daughter's future. The mention of his daughter made Dr. Ahmadi's face go pale. He asked how they knew about his daughter. Vandermeer explained that they'd done their research, that they understood his daughter needed medical treatment for a congenital heart condition, treatment that wasn't available in Iran, and that international sanctions made it nearly impossible for Iranian citizens to access in European hospitals. This was the leverage that Mossad had identified months earlier through signals intelligence and financial records analysis. Dr. Ahmadi's daughter was 9 years old. She'd been born with a heart defect that required specialized surgery. Iranian doctors could manage her condition temporarily, but the definitive treatment required pediatric cardiac surgery expertise and facilities that didn't exist in Tehran. Dr. Ahmadi had been trying for 2 years to arrange treatment abroad, but sanctions against Iran made it impossible to transfer the money required or to get the necessary medical visas. He'd watched his daughter's condition gradually worsen, knowing that every month of delay reduced her chances of successful intervention. This was the psychological pressure point that made Dr. Ahmadi vulnerable to recruitment, not ideology or politics, but the desperate need of a father who would do anything to save his child's life. Vandermeer said that the organization he represented could arrange the medical treatment. They had connections with pediatric cardiac specialists in Germany who could perform the surgery. They could facilitate the necessary visas, handle all financial arrangements, and ensure that Dr. Ahmadi's daughter received the best possible care. In exchange, they needed Dr. Ahmadi to provide information about Iran's nuclear program, not publicly, not in a way that would expose him immediately, but through quiet cooperation that would give Israeli intelligence insight into Iran's weapons development progress. They'd protect his identity, they'd ensure his safety, and when the time came that his position became too dangerous, they'd extract him and his family to a country where they could live without fear. Dr. Ahmadi asked how he could trust them. Vandermeer pulled out a tablet computer and showed him medical records that had been prepared by German cardiac specialists who'd reviewed his daughter's case, transmitted to Mossad through intermediaries. The specialists had outlined a treatment plan, identified the specific procedures required, and provided a timeline for when the surgery could be performed. They'd even noted that the girl's current condition was still operable, but that waiting more than 6 months would significantly increase surgical risks. The documentation was real. Mossad had actually consulted with German doctors, provided them with medical records obtained through Iranian hospital database breaches, and secured their agreement to perform the surgery. The operation would be funded through Israeli intelligence budgets, but the doctors would believe they were participating in a humanitarian case facilitated by a European NGO. Dr. Ahmadi looked at the treatment plan with the expression of someone seeing hope for the first time in years. Vandermeer let him read through the entire document without interruption. Then he said that the first payment for medical arrangements could be processed within 48 hours if Dr. Ahmadi agreed to cooperate. The surgery could be scheduled within 3 weeks. His daughter could be in Germany receiving treatment before the end of the year. All Dr. Ahmadi had to do was say yes and begin providing the information that Israeli intelligence needed to understand Iran's nuclear program. Dr. Ahmadi asked for time to think. Vandermeer said he could have until the end of dinner, but not longer. The operational window was narrow. Dr. Ahmadi would be returning to Tehran in 2 days. Once he was back in Iran, making contact would become exponentially more difficult and dangerous. If he was going to agree, it needed to happen now in Istanbul, where they could establish secure communication protocols and provide him with the tools he'd need to transmit information safely. Dr. Ahmadi excused himself to use the restroom. This was the moment of maximum uncertainty in any recruitment operation. When the target steps away to think privately, you don't know if they're genuinely considering the offer or planning to call security services and report the contact. The Mossad street team outside the restaurant tensed, ready to abort the operation if Dr. Ahmadi emerged and tried to flag down Turkish police or contact Iranian embassy officials. Inside the Four Seasons suite, the monitoring team tracked his mobile phone signal to confirm he wasn't making calls. Dr. Ahmadi stood in the restaurant bathroom, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He was thinking about his daughter, about watching her struggle to breathe after minimal physical activity, about the fear in her eyes during medical appointments when doctors explained they'd done everything they could with available resources. He was thinking about the work he'd been doing for Iran's nuclear program, work he'd initially believed was about energy independence, but had gradually realized was about weapons development. He'd seen the technical specifications. He'd attended meetings where military applications were discussed explicitly. He knew exactly what his research was contributing to, and he'd been trying to convince himself for months that it was justified, that Iran needed nuclear deterrence to defend itself against hostile neighbors and Western intervention. But he'd never fully believed that justification. He'd stayed because leaving seemed impossible, because defection would mean abandoning his family and his life, because he couldn't see a way out. Now he was being offered a way out, not a dramatic defection that would make international headlines, but a quiet arrangement where he could continue his life while working against the regime he'd grown to distrust. The price was betrayal. He'd be spying for Israel, providing intelligence that would be used against his own country. If he was caught, he'd be executed as a traitor. His family would be punished. His name would be disgraced. But if he succeeded, his daughter would live. She'd get the surgery she needed. She'd have a chance at a normal life. And maybe, in some small way, he'd be preventing a catastrophic war by giving Israeli intelligence the information they needed to understand Iran's nuclear capabilities without resorting to military strikes that would kill thousands. He couldn't know if that rationalization was genuine strategic thinking or just moral justification for doing what he desperately wanted to do anyway. Intelligence officers are trained to exploit exactly this kind of psychological ambiguity, to make targets believe they're serving a higher purpose when they're really just choosing self-interest. Dr. Ahmadi returned to the table. He sat down, looked directly at Vandermeer, and asked what would happen next. Vandermeer knew that meant yes. Targets who are planning to refuse don't ask about next steps. He signaled the waiter for coffee, buying a few more minutes of conversation time, and then explained the communication protocols. Dr. Ahmadi would be given an encrypted smartphone, commercially available technology that wouldn't raise suspicion, but had been modified with software that created a secure channel to Israeli intelligence. He'd communicate using a specific email account that appeared to be a personal account, but was monitored constantly by Mossad. He'd send messages that looked like ordinary personal correspondence, but contained coded information about his work. Simple phrases that to anyone else would seem like discussions about family or daily life, but to his handlers would convey specific intelligence about nuclear program developments. Vandermeer reached into his briefcase and removed a small package wrapped in ordinary brown paper. Inside was a Samsung smartphone, the kind sold in electronics stores throughout Europe and the Middle East. There was nothing obviously suspicious about the device. It looked like any other smartphone Dr. Ahmadi might purchase during his travels, but the device had been prepared by Mossad's Technical Services Division with modifications that were invisible to casual inspection. The operating system included hidden encryption software that activated when Dr. Ahmadi used a specific email application. The camera could be remotely activated to photograph documents without leaving any indication on the phone that photos had been taken. Most importantly, the phone had a duress feature. If Dr. Ahmadi ever felt he was under immediate threat, he could enter a specific passcode that would wipe all sensitive data and send an emergency signal to his handlers, indicating he'd been compromised. Vandermeer walked Dr. Ahmadi through the basic procedures. He was to use the phone normally for personal communications, making calls to family, checking email, using social media, establishing a pattern of regular usage that wouldn't seem unusual to anyone monitoring his activities. But when he needed to transmit intelligence, he'd compose an email to a specific address that appeared to be a European technology consulting firm. The emails would discuss fictional consulting projects using terminology that seemed like business jargon but actually conveyed specific intelligence information. For example, a message saying, "The Milan project is proceeding ahead of schedule with delivery expected in 6 months," would indicate that uranium enrichment was progressing faster than publicly acknowledged, with weapons-grade material projected within 6 months. They'd provided Dr. Ahmadi with a codebook disguised as a business reference guide, the kind of document an academic might carry for professional purposes, that contained the full vocabulary for encoding his reports. The financial arrangements were handled with equal care. Vandermeer explained that 50,000 euros had already been deposited into a Swiss bank account established in Dr. Ahmadi's name. He provided the account details on a piece of paper that Dr. Ahmadi was instructed to memorize and then destroy. The account could be accessed through normal banking channels, but Dr. Ahmadi was advised not to touch the money yet. Drawing on it immediately after returning from Istanbul would create a suspicious pattern. Instead, he should wait at least 3 months before making any withdrawals, and when he did, they should be small amounts that could be explained as savings from his legitimate academic salary. Additional payments would be made quarterly based on the quality and quantity of intelligence he provided. The medical arrangements for his daughter would begin immediately. Vandermeer provided contact information for a European medical coordinator who Dr. Ahmadi would communicate with directly. This person was real, actually employed by a legitimate medical facilitation company that helped international patients access European healthcare but was also a Mossad asset who'd facilitate the case while reporting all developments back to Israeli intelligence. Dr. Ahmadi would tell Iranian authorities that he'd made contact with this organization during his Istanbul conference, that they specialized in helping patients from countries with limited medical resources access advanced treatment. The story was plausible enough that Iranian security services would likely accept it, especially since medical treatment for children was one area where the regime sometimes showed flexibility in allowing foreign travel. The actual surgery would be performed in Hamburg at a children's hospital known for pediatric cardiac care. Vandermeer also explained the contingency plans. If Dr. Ahmadi ever felt his cover was compromised, if Iranian counterintelligence began investigating him, if he received any indication that his communications were being monitored, he was to immediately cease all intelligence activities and activate the duress protocols on his phone. Mossad would then execute an emergency extraction plan that had already been prepared. He'd be instructed to travel to Turkey or another neighboring country under any pretext he could arrange. Once outside Iran, Mossad operatives would make contact and move him to Israel or a third country where he'd be given asylum. His wife and daughter would be extracted through separate channels if they couldn't travel together. Dr. Ahmadi and Vandermeer finished their coffee at 9:45 p.m. They shook hands in the restaurant, appearing to anyone watching like two businessmen concluding a productive dinner meeting. Dr. Ahmadi carried the package containing his new smartphone in a shopping bag, along with some tourist souvenirs he'd purchased earlier that day, camouflage that made the phone just another item acquired during his Istanbul visit. He returned to the Para Palace Hotel, unaware that the Iranian security officers who'd been monitoring him throughout his trip had observed his dinner meeting, but assessed it as exactly what it appeared to be. Their report would note the meeting, but wouldn't flag it as suspicious. Dr. Ahmadi had successfully made contact with Israeli intelligence without triggering any counterintelligence alarms. Back at the Four Seasons, the operational team began the methodical process of sanitizing the Bosphorus suite. Every piece of technical equipment was carefully packed into specialized cases designed to look like ordinary luggage. The laptop computers were wiped and restored to factory settings. The directional microphone was disassembled and distributed across multiple bags, so no single piece of luggage would contain suspicious equipment if inspected. The furniture was returned to its original configuration. The suite was cleaned thoroughly, not just for tidiness, but to remove any forensic evidence that might indicate the room had been used for purposes other than luxury accommodation. By 2:30 a.m., the Bosphorus suite looked exactly as it had when Henrik Vandermeer first checked in 4 days earlier. The team members checked out of the Four Seasons separately over the following morning, just as they'd checked in. Henrik Vandermeer settled his bill, tipped generously, and thanked the staff for their excellent service and discretion. A hotel car drove him to Istanbul Ataturk Airport, where he boarded a flight to Amsterdam using his Dutch passport. The Mossad officer behind the cover would return to Tel Aviv and begin the next phase of the operation, serving as Dr. Ahmadi's handler for however long the asset remained productive and secure. The other team members scattered to different destinations, flying to European cities or taking ferries across the Bosphorus before eventually making their way home through circuitous routes. Dr. Ahmadi returned to Tehran 2 days later, carrying the smartphone in his luggage. Iranian customs inspected his bags, but found nothing unusual. He passed through airport security and returned to his apartment where his wife and daughter were waiting. He told his daughter that he'd found doctors who could help her, explaining about the medical coordinator and the possibility of surgery in Germany. His wife cried with relief, having no idea that her husband had just agreed to commit espionage against their own government. Over the following months, Dr. Ahmadi began transmitting intelligence through his encrypted phone. He reported on technical developments in Iran's uranium enrichment program, photographed classified documents, and provided timeline projections for when Iran would achieve weapons-grade nuclear material. His daughter's surgery was successfully performed in Hamburg 6 weeks after the Istanbul meeting. Dr. Ahmadi continued his intelligence work for 3 years before Iranian counterintelligence finally identified patterns suggesting a security breach. He received a duress signal warning and fled to Turkey during a business trip. Mossad extracted him and his family to Israel, where they were given new identities and resettled in a European country. The operation that began in a luxury hotel suite in Istanbul became one of Mossad's most successful technical recruitments of the decade. The Four Seasons Hotel never knew that their Bosphorus suite had served as command headquarters for an operation that recruited an Iranian nuclear scientist. The housekeeping staff cleaned the suite after Vandermeer's checkout and prepared it for the next wealthy guest. The hotel's security cameras had recorded everything, but nobody ever reviewed that footage with suspicion because nothing had appeared unusual. Just another group of European businessmen conducting private negotiations in Istanbul. And that's exactly how successful intelligence operations work, not through dramatic action, but through meticulous planning that makes espionage indistinguishable from ordinary business, until years later when declassified reports reveal what actually happened in that suite overlooking the Bosphorus.